Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling. Hello there to all my patrons and those who kindly support me on this platform. Last year was the first occasion in 16 years that we have not been fortunate enough to go over to the UK on a lecture tour on account of the coronavirus worldwide. And it was a cause for deep introspection and sadness for us, in that Karen and I thoroughly enjoy these lecture tours. We've had such fantastic experiences over in the UK, and the British people are always so very kind to us and generous in terms of their hospitality, their hosting, and the events that they ask me to address. And some of the experiences that we've had over time have been incredibly humorous and memorable. I was on one occasion invited to speak at the Royal College of Music, and the client who invited me to speak there said that they wanted to combine my storytelling with some music, so they'd arranged a world-renowned pianist to be playing the Steinway piano, and she would stop, and then I would tell half my story. She would come back onto the stage, play the second part of what she was destined to do, and then I would finish my story. Well, when I met this pianist who was warming up in the afternoon, and we went to have a look at the stage and the venue and so forth, I realized that I was heading for some difficulty, in that this beautiful woman looked like a model. She had long dark hair that stretched all the way down to her waist. Just gorgeous, never mind the fact that she was a world-renowned pianist. And she had woolen gloves on to keep her hands warm, and she played the piano, I say, somewhat irreverently, like God. It was the most incredible experience. Well, come the evening time, I was told to stand behind the curtains on one side of the stage, and she was going to open the show with her incredible music on the piano. And when she stopped, I was going to step out. The spotlight would come across to me, and I would start with my story and do the first half of my story. Well, I want to tell you that when she stopped playing the piano and I stepped out from behind the curtain, there were guffaws of laughter, more so than I think even Laurel and Hardy could have created. Because to go from her incredible music and her looks to me standing there in my open neck shirt, my shorts, my veldskoens and a stick was quite remarkable. And I remember looking at the folks in the front row who were down below stage level, looking up at me and wondering how on earth I was going to try and equal what she had done. It was impossible. So I did the first half of my story. She played the second half of her wonderful resume, and then I completed my story. But it's a night that I will never forget in terms of the contrasts of folks' entertainment at the Royal College of Music in London, right next to the Royal Albert Hall, with this gorgeous, world-renowned pianist playing, and then me trying to tell one of my stories. On another occasion, I was fortunate enough to speak at St. James's Palace, and there were 200 of the who's who of London coming. Everyone had to have their credentials ascertained, along with security details, that there weren't going to be any problems. And amongst the guests was none other than Jeremy Clarkson, who we've had quite a lot to do with over the years and have enjoyed a number of meals with him. And right at the 11th hour, he said that he wanted to come to the talk, at which point the talk was already full, and there were considerable strings to be pulled to get his security arrangements made and so forth for him to join the talk. Anyway, everyone was standing outside of St. James's Palace, beautifully dressed in their black suits and so forth. I was there in my shorts and open neck shirt, as I always am, and many of my friends wanted to meet Jeremy Clarkson. They couldn't believe that he was coming to the talk. And in the excitement of it all, we all started to go into the venue. It was hosted by Prince Harry. And when I got to the desk, this chap with the little transmitter in his ear and all the weapons and all that, the security guy said, "Sir, will you step aside?" So I stepped aside, sort of to the other side of this entrance atrium, whilst the guests in the queue continued to file in once their name had been checked off on the list. And it turns out that in the excitement and in the arrangements for the talk, my name as the speaker had not been included in the guests' who were attending the talk. And the security folks were just doing their job. They immediately saw a problem for me and for Karen that our names was not on the list. And it was a rather strange situation because it was the last lecture on a very exhausting tour. I was feeling exhausted, and perhaps my patience was in less abundance than usual, because I said to the security folks, listen, the car that brought me here is still outside. So I'll just go back to the car and I'll go back to the place where I'm staying in West London. And once you've sorted out the arrangements and whether I should or shouldn't be here, perhaps we can make another plan. And I was about to leave when some of my friends stepped forward and were horrified at the idea that I was going to leave. And they said to the security, do you really think that anybody would gate crash an event dressed as he is if he wasn't a speaker? The talk tonight is about the Anglo-Zulu War. This guy's been speaking in our country for years on the Anglo-Zulu War, complete with his stick. You can even see it in his logo. Do you really think that he would be in this queue if he were not destined to be here? He is the reason we are all here, is to hear him speak. Anyway, a minor crisis was averted. We went in and we had a thoroughly good evening. Prince Harry was in top form. I remember meeting him. He came up the stairs at the far end of a large hall, and he walked straight across to me, and without batting an eyelid, he said, I can see you've dressed for the event. Well, in his introduction, he said he couldn't believe that anybody had arrived to address an audience in St. James's Palace dressed as I was. It brought the house down. Karen sat next to him for the evening, and he was a charming, delightful host. I can only say good things about him. Well, on another occasion, we were fortunate enough to do a talk in a very old, state-of-the-art farm barn down in southern Hampshire. A barn that has perhaps stood for 400 years. As a result, the inside is incredibly dry, tinder dry. And a mad friend of mine, the world authority on the Martini Henry rifle used in the Anglo-Zulu War, called Neil Aspenshaw, arrived to enhance the show. And Neil arrived dressed in kit of the period, the blue woolen trousers and the red serge tunic, the pith helmet and all the rest. And he had with him a Martini Henry rifle and a bayonet. And he said that he was going to do some bayonet drills for us during the course of my talk, and he would let off some blank rounds. Well, I didn't think that there was going to be any problem with that until he let off the first blank round, and the wad shot out of the blank and started a minor fire in the tinder and the cobwebs on the edge where the roof meets the wall of this barn. And we quickly were able to pull that down and put it out, and realized the danger of setting the barn alight on account of these blank rounds. So my dear friend Neil Aspenshaw has caused me some anxious moments and some embarrassment in England, because on another occasion we were at Catterick outside of York, and I was doing a talk in the dining hall, and they had tried to make it a little smaller and more intimate by suspending a tent within the dining hall. And Neil went through some of his Martini Henry rifle drills, and he's put his bayonet right through the tent roof above us, causing some consternation amongst the senior officers who were sitting there. Anyway, the list and the time goes on, because these lectures in England began for me in 2004, a good 16, nearly 17 years ago now, when a retired police detective from Essex invited me, he was a guest at Fugitives Drift Lodge, to come across to England as his guest, and he would show me around. He'd take me down to Brecon, to the museum and the cathedral, where many of the men who died at De St. Juana had indeed worshipped and sung hymns in their day. He would take me to some of the famous Victoria Cross graves, and in it I would do 3 talks, one for the St. John Ambulance, another one for a local charity in Brettonwood where he lived, and the third was to do a BBC radio chat with a chap called Steve Scruton, who was the host and the presenter. And the couple who were kind enough to invite me on that trip will never know what the gesture meant to me, and what an incredible launch it would be into a storytelling career, really, in England. Because I've been fortunate enough to go back to England every year since, building up a collection of clients, building up my repertoire of stories, and trying to work on more and more venues, more and more events, and trying, obviously, to make it a viable part of our financial landscape. And in the early days, we used to travel around by train. We thought that trains were the most cost-effective way of travelling around. And the host would pick us up at the train, take us to his or her home. We'd host the event, and then the following day they'd take me back to the train to catch a train to the next event. Now the problem with that is that the big hubs in England, like London, like York, you have to return to catch a train out to your next event. So quite often we'd have a talk, for example, in Kent, and then we'd have to go back into London to catch the next train to a function perhaps in Hampshire or in Essex. And very often the timing of the trains was such that we would arrive at our next event late morning. And our delightful host or hostess would pick us up. And on the way back to the home, they'd say, you know, my Aunt Madge is quite deaf. And she lives in an old age retirement village. And some of her friends are quite deaf. And they're very worried that they won't be able to hear tonight at the function. So we've invited them for lunch. And we would love you to tell them the story of Isant Luana over lunch. Now, this might all sound meek and mild and innocent enough. The problem with it is, when you are doing talks 6 evenings a week, we generally don't speak on a Sunday, 6 evenings a week, generally involved with a dinner and hosting a dinner party at the time of the event, either before or after, it becomes absolutely exhausting. And it wasn't long before we realized that it was completely unsustainable. We could definitely not continue by train, host people over lunch, sharing the stories, doing the same thing in the evening with a dinner party, and then traveling the next day by train, invariably to strangers, where you're sleeping in a strange bed, being hosted by strangers who have always been absolutely delightful and charming. So we decided that we could probably afford to move on to car hire. And Karen always jokes with me because she says, depending on how flush we are feeling, would determine the sort of car that we would hire. On one occasion, we were picking up a car right in central London in Russell Square, and I got there to collect the car that we had organised for a morning pickup because we had to be out in Bedfordshire for a talk at mid-afternoon, and an important talk. And I got to the car hire depot and the car wasn't ready. And there was a West Indian lady who was in charge of the counter and what was happening there. And I don't think that anything could have prepared her for my outburst, because I really was very irritated and very angry that the car that we'd confirmed the previous day was not ready. Well, anyway, the next thing, she's on the phone to her boss and she says, can she hire out a car? It meant nothing to me. She just gave the registration number and she obviously got an affirmative answer. So she gives me the key and tells me to go down into the basement. All these cars were parked underground, and collect the car corresponding to this registration number. It was in bay number 41. And I went down there, and would you believe, there stood a gleaming silver Volkswagen Touareg, which happens to be Karen's dream car. So I drove this car up out of the basement to Karen, who was waiting at reception with our luggage, and she couldn't believe it. She could not believe that we had been upgraded to this car for a long, long period of time and a lot of miles around England. I think on that trip we drove 1,800 miles around England to various venues, including Scotland, in this VW Touareg. And we were always worried that it gave completely the wrong impression to our hosts, who thought that they were paying us far too much for a talk on account of the quality of the car that we had hired. And we had to try and allay their fears by saying that it was a very, very unusual and unexpected upgrade on account of our car not being ready. And then, of course, Karen, on occasions, goes to the other extreme. So one year, she decides that she's going to hire a Fiat 500. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Fiat 500. It is the closest equivalent I can express to a sardine can with 4 little wheels. And our bags were so large that we had to fold the back seats down to fit our 2 suitcases into the back of the car, at which point there was nothing left for anything else. And then Karen and I got into this tiny little Italian vehicle with our shoulders touching, and they would touch for the remaining 800 miles of that particular tour. And we took off in this little powder blue Fiat 500 to a wonderful country estate called Ditchingham in Norfolk. It is the most beautiful place. Do you know that all the fence lines close to the manor house are situated in ditches or trenches? So when you look out across this parkland environment where the magnificent host and a man who's become a close friend, the Earl, who breeds a rare form of ancient cattle called Chartwell cattle, you look out over this park-like environment and don't see a fence, because all the fences are situated in ditches or trenches, so you don't see them. So we arrive in this tiny little car, and I park in the driveway where the fountain alone is 4 times the size of the car, and have to climb out of the car a bit like Houdini, and our delightful host comes out to greet us and he says, Rob, I want you to leave that car right here, because I'm quite sure that nobody in Norfolk has ever seen a car of this size, and I want all my guests who are coming tonight, who are not allowed to park there, they have to park around the back out of sight. He wants all of them to see that little powder blue Fiat 500 in his yard. It was quite a moment. We'll never forget it, the humor that that little car caused. And I want to tell you that the effect was quite significant, because most of the hosts, when we arrived in that car, thought they weren't paying us enough for a talk on account of the tiny little car we'd hired. It was such a success that Karen hired a similar car the following year. The year after that, Karen hired a car made by Hyundai that I haven't seen yet in this country, called a Kona, Kona. It has the most unusual headlights, but most importantly, the car was a bright burnt orange in color. In my opinion, one of the most unlikely and hideous colors for a car, and there was no way that we could hide our presence anywhere in England as we traveled around in this burnt orange Kona. It was a great car, efficient on fuel. It certainly went well enough. It had more than enough space for the luggage, but the color left much to be desired. On another occasion, we were unfortunate enough to hire a car in a tiny little outlying station, not far from Loughborough. And would you believe they gave me a Peugeot 208. Now, I don't want to say too much on this little chat about French automobiles, but the car was so poorly designed, I really battled to get in and out of it. And when you sat in the driver's seat, between the steering wheel and the position of the indicator lever and the wiper lever, everything was obscured. So you couldn't see the speedo, you couldn't see the fuel gauge, you couldn't even see clearly the indicator stick or the wiper stick on the other side. And I drove it for exactly 36 hours. And I called them and said that the car was bad enough that there's no way I would continue with it, with a long tour ahead of us. And we were fortunate enough to exchange it for an Opel Kadett, which was infinitely better. And these little stories and these wonderful little nuances give these tours an incredible appeal. I remember that in that Opel Kadett that we were fortunate enough to upgrade to, we had a talk at a farm barn out in Suffolk on a glorious English evening, sunshine, people standing out on the lawn having canapes and a drink of wine. And in this barn were combine harvesters and tractors and a huge pile of hay bales. And the chairs that we used were so dusty we all had to give them a wipe before we sat down. But Karen and I agree confidently and happily that it was one of the happiest and most appropriate events in the UK, because I come from a farming background. I always dress like a farmer. I carry a stick. Karen loves tractors and combines and hay bales. And having this talk in this farm barn was just magnificent. On another occasion, we were fortunate enough to go to Jersey to do some talks in Jersey hosted by Standard Bank. Some of the talks were to raise money for the Gerald Durrell Zoo and the Centre for Endangered Species, where they breed all sorts of endangered wildlife. And they had a very large audience, around 400 strong, in a magnificent school hall, beautiful cut blue stone in Jersey. And would you believe I was at the height of my lecture, building it up to a crescendo. I was on a stage. Guests were sitting in this huge hall on a wooden floor. The next thing, there was a loud bang. And I saw Karen near the back jump up and rush over to the other side of the hall. And I realized that some poor guest had fainted. And he'd fallen off his chair onto the floor, hence the loud bang. And there was a tremendous fuss, because a number of people rushed across there, all of whom were doctors. And of course, everybody was vying for the opportunity to assist and offer their expertise. And the poor man, when he came round, all he wanted was for them all to bugger off and give him a chance to catch his breath. It was very hot and stuffy in the hall, and he had fainted. Anyway, trying to resume the lecture was quite difficult after that. It turns out that the guest who fainted was fine. But it's quite challenging getting your audience back and getting your lecture back on track, trying to talk to 400 people, and you've been doing so for 45 minutes when an incident like that happens. Now, not having been to the UK last year on a lecture tour on account of coronavirus, and it's extremely unlikely that we're going to be able to get across there this year with the fears of the virus and, of course, the issues with large gatherings, it is cause for great sadness for us. Because I want to tell you, it is one of the great highlights of our year, every year, and has been for the last 16 years, to plan and plot a tour in the UK, giving lectures, being hosted by delightful British people, and sharing the stories that are so dear to the British mind of their heroes in yesteryear. And I pray that if we are not able to get back there this year, 2021, we will get back there soonest in 2022, as those lecture tours are extremely important and dear to us. And I hope you've enjoyed a few little anecdotes about those lecture tours and what goes on in England, and perhaps on another occasion I will share more. Thank you very much.